All right, well, let's begin the conversation. Today, this is the book talk here with Professor Morgan Polikoff. You are the Associate Professor of Education at USC, University of Southern California School of Rossier School of Education. And I am holding a copy of the book of which I've had the joy to read over the last month. And I'll say, like, you give a good review of the standards-based education reform movement, a lot of its failures, and identify what I think a lot of the people who are listening here today and are involved in the work here recognize as one of the most important things that hasn't been done well, which is understanding what high quality instructional material, the role it plays, and the ways that we can do better curriculum reform. Why don't we just do some table setting, and then Morgan, I'll ask you some questions, identify some of the key themes, and really get a sense of like what should we get out of this. So let's first take a step back, and if you would, like, how is it that you got into education in the first place? Like, why are you writing a book about the of beyond standards, curriculum material? You're a professor of education. How'd you get into this?
So, you know, my memory for things that happened in the past is not always the best, but my recollection of the chain of events is essentially, you know, I did an undergraduate math education program at the University of Illinois, and I was always really interested in the role of standards. And my recollection is that I even maybe wrote my graduate school admission essay on standards. Andy, my advisor, happens to be on the call. If he happens to remember my essay, he might be able to attest to that. But I was always interested in standards, and I happened to wind up working with Andy Porter, who is one of the nation's leading experts on standards. And we did some work when I was in graduate school on that topic, on issues of alignment of standards and assessments. This predated Common Core. And then I did my dissertation on standards implementation. And really, I've been studying standards implementation for the 11 years now that I've been a professor at USC. I've just always been interested in understanding, you know, how we get teachers to teach good content in the classroom, right? We have these standards, they're out there by all accounts. Teachers implement standards sort of partially or fitfully, or maybe not so well at all. And so what can we do through policy to drive better standards implementation? And over time, in sort of the last 5 or 6 years, I've really come to focus on the role of curriculum materials, and had a number of different projects about the role of curriculum materials in driving standards implementation. I was also co-PI of the IES-funded Center on Standards Implementation, which Andy and Laura, who were both on the call, were also co-PIs on. Mm-hmm. And we studied, you know, that issue from a number of different perspectives, including some detailed case studies of districts where it seemed like, you know, just over time, it became apparent to me that in places where standards implementation was going well, that that there were really quality curriculum materials and you know, a vision for instructional reform that was centered around implementation of standards through those curriculum materials. So that's kind of how the book came to be, and sort of, you know, where I am now in terms of my thinking.
And some basics everyone needs to know. The book is Beyond Standards. You can buy it at Amazon. You can buy it, I assume, at Harvard Education Press. Do you have a preference where people secure their materials?
If you use the Harvard Education Press website, there's a discount code for 20% off if you're trying to save a few dollars.
And of course, Whiteboard Advisors has purchased a variety of these books in bulk. So get in contact with us as well, because the work that you've done here is, I think, points to what's probably going to be one of the most important issues for school reform, for improvement of instruction going forward. I think it's interesting when you look at the standards reform movement, the way that it has evolved and danced around this issue for decades. And in part, you point out, like, the federal government can't, they're prohibited. But, when you were doing some early work on standards, I was working with a guy by the name of Dennis Doyle, and he wrote this book, World Class Standards. And just the identification of, like, how do you provide consistency and coherence into the work and into the trade of what teachers are trying to do. And so what's that narrative that they're trying to express, convey, and engage students upon and with, and how do you do that well? And there's been a long arc to this story, right? And so, one of the themes is, let's talk about some of the themes in this book. I think an important theme is a recognition, and sometimes we don't always do it well, but we should move beyond standards-based reform initiatives. And that has been, for the last 30 years, the framework for thinking about the way we approach policy, the way we approach improvement, school improvement and accountability. So let's unpackage that a bit. Am I right to assert that you want to move beyond standards-based reform? And as we think about it, like, what are we salvaging from that effort that should continue to go forward?
Yeah, I mean, so the book is called Beyond Standards, and I think that the argument isn't that we should scrap standards that we have, or that it's not important to have some expectations and some consistency for what students should know and be able to do at various grades. But the argument is really that that cannot be enough. It will not be enough to drive instruction in any meaningful way, right? We're too decentralized for that to happen with 13,000 school districts, where there's too much teacher authority over what goes on in the classroom. So even if a local school district is somewhat more prescriptive, teachers like and teachers exercise authority over what they teach. That's sort of a defining characteristic of American teaching. And if anything, there's evidence that it's increasing teachers' use of supplemental materials. And so the argument isn't that we should scrap standards. The argument is that if we really want to change instruction at scale, we have to go beyond standards to really quality core curriculum materials that are actually adopted in schools and districts, that states actually have a role in encouraging districts to adopt or requiring districts to adopt, that school districts, that states and districts need to be much more consistent in their expectations that teachers actually use those materials, and in building structures that allow them to use those materials productively, and when they need to supplement, to do so in ways that are coherent. That there has to be more tightness in the system, or else we might not even bother. Because I think what we've seen from the last decade of standards, in particular under Common Core, is there's just a lot of stagnation. It's not clear that outcomes are really getting better for anyone. There's sort of modest evidence of teachers' instructional changes over this time period, but sometimes even in ways that run counter to what the standards are calling for. So it's just not, standards alone can't do it.
Well, let me push back, all right, for 1 second. I'm going to push back. And what if we just didn't give it a proper chance? So we had the Common Core, none of this was actually, maybe the argument goes, wasn't implemented well. So Secretary Duncan, back when he was kind of beginning to implement the Common Core, the statement was tight about the ends, loose about the means. What about that? Like, had Common Core rolled out well, had everyone been on the same page, would that have happened? Or was it always that policy needs to focus on that level?
I don't know that that's that different from what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that had that happened is a fantasy, that it could not happen, that the systems will not allow it to happen.
What countries?
And
I don't know. Hold on.
Well, we have a muting problem.
Yeah. Tracking it down.
That it can't happen. It can't happen in a system as decentralized as ours, and a system with as much local control as ours. So, would things have been
Yeah.
better if standards had been implemented? Sure, but that's what I'm saying. They can't have been implemented. There is no way in which they could have been implemented without greater attention to the ways that systems and structures, thwart implementation,
Yeah.
and attempts to actually change those. Which, as I sort of start the book by saying, like, the people who came up with standards were broadly right in their concerns about the quality of instruction and about the role of decentralization, but then they sort of they just stopped. They didn't actually try and attack the root cause. They just sort of said, okay, well, we'll put out the standards and there'll be some accountability and people will want to change. But the idea of standards is some degree of standardization, and they didn't really build in any approach to meaningfully drive that kind of standardization.
Yeah, or maybe it's a longer dialogue and it's in development, but I feel like that's multiple careers and it doesn't really pan out that way. Or what about the question, maybe they don't understand the root cause of the issue. So we talk about tracking it down. We talk about high quality instructional material, right? Like that's central to some of the conversation. But how do we know something is of high quality? There's a lot of reference to ed reports here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reference to what the state should be doing. I mean, I've been at this gig for a long time. I don't know, is it like, as you mentioned in the book, is it like, it when you see it? I don't want to make the analogy to pornography, but
right.
Like, so what is it? How do we know something is of high quality?
Well, I think this is a great question. We're hampered in part by the data and the evidence that we have, and which is, as you point out, not that strong about what materials are good and what materials are not good. So I think part of this is, that the system itself has made evaluation of the quality of materials more or less impossible, right? We don't have good data on what's used anywhere. We can't track that. We don't really know, even if something is adopted, whether it's used. I do think that, states starting with ed reports, or if they feel like they want to go their own way, doing their own ratings of materials is perfectly reasonable. Along, ed reports does mostly content stuff, but there's also some usability in there. They're increasingly paying attention to cultural relevance or cultural appropriateness, and I think that's possibly important. I think effectiveness in terms of impacts on student outcomes is also something that you might think of as being a marker of quality, and we just don't have really super good evidence on that for any particular material. I think that evidence can evolve over time, but even if we had really good evidence on that, I wouldn't necessarily want that to be the only dimension on which we made decisions, because as we know, materials will, I think, work in some settings and not others, and for some populations and not others. And so, we can't answer that question. It's a chicken and an egg problem, right? It's like, we don't have the consistency in adopted materials, so we can't evaluate that question at any scale. And therefore people, I routinely get emails from people. They're like, well, what material should I adopt? What do we know about the impact of this material on student achievement? And the answer is always, we don't know, because we just don't have the data.
Yeah.
Because it's not consistently adopted. Of course, we're never going to have super compelling answers to that question. But I think if there were more consistency in what is adopted, if all districts in a particular state adopted one of a set of 3 materials, then I think we will be able, and states routinely track that, then I think we will be able to start to answer those questions in more convincing ways.
Now, in the book, you talk about some research you've done in districts that are coherent, that are consistent, and that perform wonderfully, kind of beyond expectations. Should we look to these districts to understand how they do it, or is it a combination of how and what they use? Like for years, again, as long as I've been doing this work, there's an understanding that you could use almost any kind of material. So long as there's buy-in, so long as there's consistency across the teachers, across the administrative levels. So when done well, not everything, but a lot of products will work.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into
Well,
What needs to be done?
my gut is that I would generally agree with that, that there's a set of materials that are reasonably well aligned with standards and that take maybe slightly different approaches to maybe organization or structure or something like that. And that probably it is much more about, I do present some case studies in the book, and, Laura Desmond, who's on the call, she and I have worked together on some case studies of districts that seem to be doing this well. And, it's about leadership that, believes that curriculum materials are important, that doesn't take sort of an overly technical approach to the implementation of curriculum materials, but really understands that it's a long process, that we need teacher buy-in, that teachers need to be able to modify and want to be able to modify, but those leaders build in structures and systems that allow teachers to collaboratively work together to understand what's working and what's not. Yeah. And I suspect, again, it's more of a suspicion than based on any particularly compelling evidence, but I suspect that could be sort of regardless of material from among a set of good materials, right? So these districts, yes, did use what are called high quality materials, but I think that they could have used some other material. It was more about the coherence of the vision and the implementation of that vision, the expectation that teachers actually use these materials, and especially in the early years to really understand what's going on. So I think it's probably much more about those kinds of things than it is about the particular material itself. And actually, while the book, I think, emphasizes the importance of curriculum materials, I don't think that the book argues that it's really about finding the one best material or anything like that. I certainly don't. That's not what I think is the right approach. I think it's much more about, as I said, finding materials that you feel like work in your setting and then implementing them coherently with coherent policy supports of various kinds that we sort of lay out in the book and also in a couple papers that we've published or are under review.
Yeah, and I feel like an important theme in this book is about teacher independence, teacher behavior. I find in my work, I tell people, for the most part, I'm a really bad behavioral scientist when it comes to purchasing materials and understanding what policy does. A lot of it's behavior science, and you make it really clear that teachers, not only many of them enjoy, but it's part of their job, part of their identity, to begin to curate, to be the source of pulling this together. So is that, like, if we think about the role of the teacher, and then for our conversation, like then the role of this district and the role of the state, how all these really important independent functions come together. So let's start with the role of the teacher and giving them like the space to do what they're really good at. How does that fit into, and what from a perspective and a lot of people who will listen to us live and in recording will be philanthropies, for-profit entities, trying to understand how best to support teachers in the use of good materials and in the context of all the craziness that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I have many, many thoughts on this topic. The first, so what's the right order in which to say these thoughts? Okay, so the first thing is, I think, yes, teachers clearly like to have the autonomy to supplement and to modify their core curriculum. And that is the area, according to like Schools and Staffing Survey or other data sources, that is the area or one of the areas over which US teachers have the most autonomy. And that is, I think, a defining sort of characteristic of American teaching. I was on a separate book talk yesterday, and someone said something that made me think back to my own teacher education program. And in my own teacher education program, we spent a lot of time creating from scratch lesson plans and unit plans. We spent zero time looking at commonly used math textbooks or understanding how those material, how we might use those kinds of materials in the classroom, right? So that's just one example, but I think that that's actually a very common experience, and it sort of makes sense given that teacher education programs are sending teachers out to thousands of districts, which maybe use many different kinds of materials. They're probably not going to focus on any one. But this is just one contributing factor to this, I think, belief that American teachers have that curating their curriculum is one of their main job tasks. That said, I think that when we've talked to teachers, they really appreciate having a quality core material to use as the backbone of their instruction. Certainly some teachers have no interest in a core material and will probably never use it unless they are held down and forced. But the vast majority of teachers like to have something good to draw on to some extent. And I think what we've seen in some of our case studies and what I've seen in talking to teachers is that when they have that core material as a backbone, when they have the kinds of collaborative structures like common planning time or expectations, common planning time or inconsistent expectations for how they use those materials or how they supplement, that they do that and they're not unhappy about it. In fact, they might be a little bit more happy about it. So I think that, yes, teachers will always supplement, but I don't think that means that we must sort of throw up our hands and say that there's nothing that we can do about supplementation to make it better and more consistent.
And when I read your book, what I thought I heard, and I think that's still true, is like we could take advantage of that willingness and that eagerness to do so. So supplementation is going to happen. So how do we, back to that behavior change and the study behavior, how do we then take that and make that part of the key function and also connect it to well-vetted, well-reviewed materials? So and part of this is, me thinking of an audience of publishers, supplemental providers, that this distinction between core and supplement and like the integration of the two is a real opportunity. They certainly like a core, and there should be some enhancements. So are there ways and are there districts that are doing a good job of not only implementing what they're supposed to implement, but then drawing down resources that are well vetted, high quality, and on and on? Like who's doing that well?
I don't know that I know the answer to that question. Supplementation is one of these phenomena that is sort of ubiquitous and yet very understudied. How teachers make decisions about what materials to use, the quality of available materials. I mean, I think we have some evidence that the quality of available materials is not wonderful, but nonetheless, teachers are using them.
Google search.
Yeah, Google, Pinterest, and Teachers Pay Teachers. I mean, like 2/3 or 3/4 of all US teachers have an account on Teachers Pay Teachers. And certainly some of the materials on that website are good and some of the materials are bad, and who the hell knows what's what, because every single material on the website has a 5-star rating if you go and look. So who's doing this well? I think the answer is, I don't really know the answer to that question. I will say the book talk yesterday was with the Association of State Supervisors of Mathematics. So these are people in state departments of education who are involved in curriculum issues. And they made pretty clear to me that the state can't probably be particularly involved in offering supplementation suggestions for individual materials, that's probably going to run afoul of some kind of violation of law. But I think that outside entities, a place like EdReports, right? You could supplement EdReports with, okay, we rated this material as aligned, but here were the areas where it sort of fell short. And here are some suggestions for how you might modify or supplement those materials to address those weaknesses. That seems like the sort of role that an outside organization could play. I think the other opportunity is if you have like an Engage New York kind of situation where it is an OER that's created in a state department of education, or similarly, Louisiana guidebooks, you can do whatever you want if you've created it yourself and it's open. But when you start to say, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, here's how you might modify that. Well, that doesn't work because, Pearson's going to get pissed off about that. So that's my understanding from the conversation I had yesterday.
What about the district level? So the district clearly has a responsibility to begin doing some of this vetting or to work with the state. What in your research and in the review of what districts are doing, are there examples of best practice on curating, on providing supplemental, or is it like theatrics? Like there are some sections of the book that point out, like, unfortunately, you go through this huge, expensive, laborious process, and at the end of the day, you know, they pick the one with a cute character in the front.
Right. I mean, I think that I'm not sure how strong this evidence is, but I do think that the most reasonable approach to me is a district, having whatever kind of adoption process they want to have. Something that builds teacher buy-in, I do think, is important. Making a decision about a set of materials, expecting teachers to use those materials sort of especially in the first year, with the expectation that first year is really about understanding what's working and what's not working about those materials for the kids in that district. And then working together sort of collaboratively, teams of teachers, to address those things that have been identified in the first year. That it's sort of a reasonable and I think relatively doable approach to implementation of materials that I think can result in more coherence than I think what's typically the adoption process, which is we go through a process, we adopt a book, it goes in the back shelf of the classroom. Some teachers use it, some teachers don't, and the school principal and school and district leadership has no idea which teachers are which, right?
Yeah, and that notion of like the district not only providing like vetting and then ensuring that the implementation is done, I think that's critically important. But you also do discuss like some sharing, some resource sharing across districts. Mm-hmm. And I think about Washoe County and Clark County in Nevada, where they began with the charge under ESSA of looking at evidence-based materials, right? Now, evidence-based is not quality. Evidence-based is a federal requirement for school improvement to make sure that there's some research behind it. They began to curate and then build upon that. And that's when other agencies came to them and asked, like, can I see your list? Like, how are you doing this review? And much of it is curating what EdReports does, but also pulling feedback from teachers, pulling feedback from schools about what works and what doesn't. And so have you seen districts who are in a position of trying to comply, in a position of trying to vet this, come up with their own solutions and come up with their frameworks that are being distributed and being well used?
Well, I'll give you a couple other sort of anecdotes that I've seen. So one is that only sort of answer your question. So one is I think that there's an appetite. So I've talked with a lot of small districts here in California, and I think that there's an appetite among small districts in particular to collaborate on adoption and implementation. I think that, in California, of course, people think of LAUSD, but we have, over 1,000 districts, many of them quite small. I think the median size is like 1,100 or something like that. And a lot of these rural counties where they might have 20 or 30 districts, there's a ton of mobility. There's all kinds of reasons why those districts would want to collaborate. Districts of that size also don't have the kind of capacity in the central office, like they don't have a dedicated curriculum person. So I think that that's really one area that is potentially promising. The modal district in the US is quite small as well. There's tons of these tiny districts. And I think, whether it's through, in California, we have county offices of education, or other states have different kinds of structures, but structures that can support small districts to work together, I think, is a great approach. I think in general, I know that state departments of education are often quite underfunded and on a shoestring budget, but I think another big point in the book is just that state departments of education have to step up. And to the extent that maybe, dollars from COVID relief or other kinds of sources can be used to amplify the efforts of the State Department of Education to better support local districts. One of the lessons for me of COVID is is just about, the COVID example is just another example of the ways that we like routinely burden local actors with really consequential decisions about which they maybe don't have a lot of evidence or don't have the expertise, or even if they do, that it's just burdensome, right? And in COVID, it was high stakes decisions about reopening or not, how to safety protocols, but it also applies in curriculum materials. We're constantly sort of heaping more and more responsibilities and high stakes decisions on local educators. And to the extent that the State Department of Education or county offices of education can better support districts by making those decisions easier on them, taking some of the decision difficulties away. I much prefer shopping at Trader Joe's to shopping at Ralph's because I have far fewer decisions to make. I think that that's a really important role for these sort of higher levels of government.
Can they do it though? So state agencies well positioned to do it. Since for decades now, they've tried to emphasize the role of the state agency. Like it's always this watershed moment where the states can really begin to take control, but it seems to slip away. Yeah. Now we're at a stimulant. This is an unprecedented time with federal dollars. Opportunity to think about equity, opportunity to really drive into, as directed by the states and districts, the factors that most influence instruction, learning, equity, which you would think are instructional materials. But can they? Like, what should the state be doing? And what kind of help does the state need to get this done?
Well, yesterday, again, I was on this call with the ASSM and they were, and what I thought was really useful was, in chapter 7, I lay out like, here are the 6 things that state departments of education should do. So they created a Google Doc and then they listed those 6 things. And then under each one, they said, can my state do, basically it was like, we already do this. Yeah. We don't do this, but we could. We don't do this, but norms would make it so that we would be unlikely to. We don't do this, but it's prohibited by state law. And I thought that was really, really interesting because you just saw all this kind of variation across states in terms of what's allowed, what they're already doing. I think oftentimes states can do a lot more than they do. And it's about norms. And it's also about understanding your local context and, the flashpoints that might blow up. And what are the language to use and how do you do things in ways that local actors appreciate rather than sort of take as usurping of their authority. So we have states as, from Nebraska is doing a lot of really important work on this topic. Louisiana is doing a lot of work on this topic. Rhode Island is doing a lot of work on this topic. Those are 3 very different states with very different contexts that are all working together behind the scenes and then working in their own state context to bring about various forms of curriculum driven reform.
All right, so in that thought, help me to unpackage the boogeyman of local control. So what is Rhode Island, Texas? They're all about local control, but Texas is always doing a lot of things at the state level.
Right.
Like how do we address this notion of local control while also advancing what needs to get done at the state level?
Well, I would look at states that have done it. I mean, Louisiana has done it. There have been a number of reports primarily by RAND researchers about the processes that have been undertaken in Louisiana. I think it's about it's about doing things. It's about 2 things. It's about, first, I think, actually doing things that help districts rather than hurt them, right? So it's about, having good curriculum materials and supporting districts to make better curriculum decisions. That's a helpful thing, right? That both reduces the burden on them and probably increases the sort of average quality of education. So it's about doing that and supporting, Louisiana, they literally provide professional development on the Louisiana guidebooks to educators from every district in the state. That is great, right? That's supportive. So it's about doing things that are actually good and supportive. And then it's also about framing and messaging them in ways that, don't run afoul of these kind of boogeymans. And I'm certainly less aware, less knowledgeable about messaging and the right language to use. And I do think that that will depend on the local context. But I think in most every state, that states can be doing more than they're doing currently on curriculum materials, whether that is just putting out a recommended list, whether that is putting out something more than a recommendation, like you must use one of these 3 materials for early reading, whether that is literally providing professional development or identifying providers of professional development, right?
Mhm.
I think it can be a menu of different kinds of state-driven approaches, and not all these states are doing it exactly the same. So I think we, if there are funders on the call, that would be a really useful set of studies, is to understand, CCSSO has been sort of leading this work, but what does it actually look like in these different states? How are they, given their own state context, how are they approaching this issue in different ways that are sort of all reaching towards the same outcome, which is good materials that are used well in every public school classroom, which, by the way, should not be a particularly high bar.
Now, let me take a step back and think, how do we connect the dots to the work that needs to be done on the cohesiveness, the coordination of quality instructional material? And like every week there's something new in education, right? Like everyone's chasing shiny objects left and right. They tend to be connected, but it's not always clear. So I'll throw out some ideas, get your response on that. Let's connect the dots so people can begin to see how this all fits together. Natalie Wexler, Science of Reading. How does that fit?
Well, I think that that's actually an angle in for a lot of states, right? So a lot of states are moving on the science of reading in K-3, and that's an area where you can, I think, easily come up with a set of materials that are well aligned with the science of reading literature, about which I'm decidedly not an expert, and then support those materials, right? So I think in some ways that's the best example, because the science is relatively good on what good reading teaching looks like, and I think it's probably less good on, like, whether you should teach fraction multiplication, before this or after that, right? So I think that that's a really great example that could, again, be like a nice illustrative case study. But the truth is that we don't have that science, I don't think, in other fields, or it's a lot more contested, right? Like if there were math people on the call, some would say we need more student-centered, and some would say we need more traditional algorithms, and I'm not well positioned to adjudicate those arguments.
And that would be similar, I assume, then for like a knowledge-rich approach, which is not that dissimilar, and it's connected to the science of reading. But would that too fit into this context? And can people, or should people understand it nested within what you're arguing for?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think that, one thing that we haven't talked about, which is the sort of obvious elephant in the room right now, is like all the nonsense that's happening in states about social studies and standards and critical race theory, and right. So like anytime you start to talk about knowledge-rich curriculum, then you have to specify, okay, which knowledge are we talking about? And you start to run afoul of these more hot button issues that, are not easily fixable, I would say. But I do think that, I do think that a knowledge-rich curriculum fits very well with this vision. The knowledge that's in curriculum materials, and this is what Louisiana is doing, right? There's content knowledge in those curriculum materials that then the tests are actually assessing on, reading and writing on some of the same content, so the students have that background knowledge when they go to take the test. And that's really only possible if large numbers of schools and districts are using a similar set of materials that has that common background knowledge.
And right now everyone's talking about critical race theory. To me, what part of me thinks, I recognize this as connected to the issue you've identified, where decentralization is a mess, and the politics of education that in many ways capitalize on decentralization is really beneficial for people who just want to stir the pot for political purposes. And I'm not gonna dive into that, but this notion of decentralization really runs counter or can create friction with that, providing that coherence and consistency. And it serves people well. Like, it serves someone who's running for office and wants to get their name in the paper. It serves them well. So, I would love to figure out a way to elevate the conversation above that, and to see if you can somehow separate those two, like what communities are doing that, how is that being done? Again, maybe Louisiana, maybe Rhode Island, maybe even Texas in places. But to figure, like, have you found that to be a problem in order to advance the high quality curriculum approach that you're arguing for?
Well, this is kind of the least developed portion of the book, chapter 8, which is more like Morgan's wish list for how to reform education. And I think on the one hand, decentralization, and there once was going to be a chapter in this book about politics, which I took out. I didn't because I'm not a political scientist, and it's sort of not obvious the way in which this issue cuts, right? So on the one hand, decentralization causes all kinds of problems, which I talk about at length in chapter 8 in particular, not just around curriculum, but around everything: segregation, school finance, et cetera. On the other hand, centralization runs its own risks. And we're seeing right now states passing these wacky laws about what can and can't be taught. Texas just said you don't teach about Martin Luther King anymore. So centralization can cause its own problems as well. And I mean, the real issue there, I think, is just polarization, which is so off the charts and is dominating everything right now. And I don't really know how to solve that. And so I just ignored it for the purposes of the book. But that's the sort of fundamental issue to me, is about just how polarization is ripping us apart in all sorts of different ways. But certainly I think it's undermining, or it certainly could be undermining, quality teaching, or teaching kids what they really need to know in public schools.
Yeah, it's smart not to dive into that with a chapter. I mean, that's a buzzsaw. Like, how are we going to solve that? So, I have a kid pointing a gun at me now. Speaking of which, Gussie, don't point the Nerf gun at me. So there he comes. So the two items I think we want to wrap up on is, recognizing, like, what should we ask for from the philanthropic community? Block him out. Say hello. They can see you, bud. They can see you. What should we ask for from the philanthropic community, from publishers, private sector who want to take part? And everyone wants to see higher quality, better implemented materials. Mm-hmm. So what are the next 2 or 3 things that they can do over the next year to really move this forward? Any thoughts on that?
Well, talk to the people who are doing the work. So talk to the people in the states who are doing this work and understand what's working for them and what's not. Ask them what resources they think they need. They would be better positioned than I would to answer that question. I know CCSSO has been very involved in this work. Mm-hmm. And I think, that kind of organization is probably one of the right sort of ways to drive it. So ask local people what they need. I think, listen, I'm a researcher, so obviously I'm going to say that we need some funding to understand how this approach can work and is working in states that are doing it, what's working and what's not working, beyond Louisiana. I think people talk about Louisiana all the time because it was sort of the first mover and it's very high profile and it had some funds attached to it. But there's other states that are doing it too now, and we need to understand. I mean, it can't be all about Louisiana, right? So, so funding good research, both qualitative and quantitative, to understand how these materials are being implemented, how these professional development experiences are working or not working. What are the sort of lingering challenges with a curriculum-driven approach? And certainly I think that, we just need supplementation is another just enormous issue, right? And so, like, teachers are going to do it, But if you go to Teachers Pay Teachers, it's like 3 million materials on there. And I think a lot of them are probably not good. And this is not, if anyone from Teachers Pay Teachers is on this call, I'm sorry, but like we need to get our hands around this issue. And I think that it's just, to me, it's a little bit alarming, like bordering on malpractice, for the idea that, we've got individual teachers going to this website, not just Teachers Pay Teachers, but pick a website of materials of totally unknown quality, and then implementing them in the classroom the next day. And we're just like accepting that this is the way that it should be. It just doesn't, it seems really problematic to me. So figuring out a strategy on supplementation, I don't know what that is exactly, but to get it to be better, to get it to support the core materials rather than undermine them. I think supplementals could play a really nice role, in particular in cultural relevance or local relevance. But figuring out how to tackle that issue, I think, is a major one.
Well, Morgan, I know we've kept you longer than anticipated. Beyond Standards I really enjoyed reading this book. A great history of Common Core, great understanding, putting it in a context, and identifying, I think, accurately what is the biggest issue that everyone has danced around for 30 years, which is the materials that kids read and teachers teach on a daily basis as one of the most important policy levers that we haven't figured out how to really use. Hopefully, we can have more conversations about that, bring attention to the issue, and certainly we appreciate all that you do in researching this, telling the story, raising the flags, identifying what can and can't or should be done. This is a process, and you're playing a really important role in that process, and we appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for attending. If you want to follow up with me, just send me an email.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.